Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session around SCCM and Intune this morning with us here at Cloud Direct. Just go through a brief agenda and then we'll get straight into the content over the next 20 minutes to half an hour. So just to begin, if my slides move. So just as an introduction, my name's Pete Murphy. I am the practice lead for modern work here at Cloud Direct, which covers most things in the Microsoft 365 suite and a little bit beyond. So my team deal with things like SCCM to Intune migrations, as well as a lot of other things within the modern workplace stack. So we'll be talking to you today around why people want to move from SCCM to Intune, and not just specifically around those technologies, but looking at things kind of broader as a device management capacity. And then looking at Intune itself as a product suite and what we can do in those areas. So just to begin with, looking at kind of security strategies as a whole, and what people see that as kind of within the industry. So in order to start on this journey, really, the first thing that I've done is Googled what is a security strategy, and the top line is exactly what comes back from that search. So not just what we would believe it to be here at Cloud Direct, but a kind of broader definition as a high-level plan for how an organisation will secure its assets. So this raises some immediate questions from anybody looking at this from a strategic point of view. Firstly, what do you define as your assets? So we'll go into that kind of briefly into a few areas as to what those assets could look like and where this whole device management piece fits into that strategy. Secondly, where would you want to control and secure your assets? So we can also look at kind of the changing environments, which have changed quite rapidly over the last few years in terms of infrastructure, in terms of how people are working and where people are working. We'd also ask ourselves, as part of that security strategy, what is our current posture? How secure do we believe we are, and how are changing ways of working going to impact that? And what would be the impact of a data breach? So there are many things that could happen as a result of a data breach, and those impacts could be financial, operational, they could be kind of data loss, they could be reputational. So in terms of understanding the impact of that breach and what would happen, it can show us how important this security strategy could be and where the key areas to tighten up might be. I'm not going to go so much into those last 2 points, but I thought it was important to put them on kind of at the outset, just so people knew kind of that those things are there to be considered. If we look firstly at kind of the changing security landscape, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen this countless times before. I know we've used this content quite frequently, but it's always important to recognise exactly what's going on. In kind of I'm not going to say old architecture, but kind of historical architecture, realistically, a lot of things were contained on premise. So this big blue circle shows what our security perimeter might have looked like. And within there are some of the key workloads that we were trying to protect as organizations. We knew that once people were on premises or connected to our on-premise infrastructure, we could wrap a big kind of force field around those things, and we could protect those data points, the devices. We could protect our applications and our users' identities because everything would come through our on-premise domain. If we look at how things have changed recently, people are starting to move to a lot more kind of cloud-based services. So we've got things which are sitting outside of that perimeter now. We've got a lot of things which are sitting outside that perimeter, and that is only growing. So using cloud-based tools, using software as a service solutions, we're placing a lot more reliance on different methods of securing our data and our applications and our identities and our devices, which is what we're going to get onto today. So in terms of general goals across organizations, these are things that we find resonate with a lot of people and are quite common across a lot of customers and partners that we speak to. What we want people to be able to do is, by and large, do the same job that they've always been able to do on premise, but from wherever they might be. So we're opening up ways of working. We're giving people the ability to work from home a lot more or from other locations if they need to. And whilst doing that, we want to enable that flexibility whilst keeping people secure. So we want to make sure that we can keep control of company devices and, more importantly, data. And we want to enable enhanced abilities for communications and collaborations which gives people a balance between work and life. So we're just opening up that flexibility. A lot of this resonates with hybrid working, remote working, opening up the workforce to a lot more possibilities. So when we look at this from a security perspective, I've already touched on kind of the four main cornerstones of things we want to protect, and I'll just go into a little in each of those before we get onto the SCCM and Intune side of things. So firstly, identity, which is kind of the cornerstone of secure access. All of these things play into a security strategy. So in terms of understanding identity, what we're trying to do with a lot of customers now is protecting users' accounts from a Microsoft Azure Active Directory perspective, which enables us to give a centralized secure identity model. So that allows us to have things such as single sign-on, where everything is put through kind of Azure AD first, and those accounts enable access to other systems, but enables you to take care of those inherent security features, such as multi-factor authentication and conditional access. It enables us to know who's accessing our resources. So whether we've got guests, third parties, contractors, we need to know who's accessing resources by way of identity and managing that identity model. There's also an argument for technology versus behavior. So although we can put a lot of technical constraints in, there's no substitute for teaching users how to protect themselves, making sure they understand the benefits of multi-factor authentication, making sure they understand how to access systems and not to just go and create accounts with things like Dropbox to make things easier for themselves. And then there's also an argument around privileged access consideration. So how are you giving people access to administration functions, be that locally, be that over the network, be that on the cloud. So things like privileged identity management play in, but also segregation of accounts. So if people are having admin access, do you want to put those on separate accounts so that it should an account be compromised, people don't get access to admin functions and data and open up the environment to a lot more risk. We've got data as the kind of second pillar of a security strategy. What we want people to be able to do is access their data to do their job from anywhere, make things convenient for them. But in doing so, we want to make sure that we are not kind of opening ourselves up to risk from data loss. So we want to protect data at rest and in transit. Part of that plays into the device piece with encryption on the devices. Part of that is in how we can protect that data, potentially by way of some compliance tools that we've got available to us. We also need to remove the reliance on the perimeter. So as we've mentioned earlier, a lot of things are moving into the cloud. So potentially we don't get those firewalls and those kind of things on premise, which stops data being exfiltrated. But we do allow ourselves to protect the data itself rather than its movement. And then again, just touching back on the earlier point of understanding what those risks are of data loss and the impact that can have on the organization. So devices is an important thing, and we'll come into this in a lot more detail. So understanding how people are going to access corporate resources, whether that be BYOD, whether that be managed devices, we need to understand how we're allowing people to access things. Consider the risks, best practices and recommendations and frameworks. So by this, we're talking about things along the lines of Cyber Essentials Plus, which can give us a lot of steer in how we want to manage those devices, how we want people to access corporate resources, and how we can set our security baselines to ensure that we're both operationally performant, but also secure and taking the right controls. And then we've got secure access versus user convenience. So this does play a little bit into the frameworks. Things like Cyber Essentials Plus recommend that any device which is accessing your corporate network is fully managed, or at least has a management wrap on it, which can preclude you from using BYOD in some instances. BYOD is massively convenient for a lot of people, particularly on mobile devices where they don't want to have to carry a corporate device and a personal device. But if your security posture is so tight that you need that segregation, then potentially the secure access overrules convenience in some aspects. And then we've got to consider that with devices, different personas could have different needs. So in some aspects, people could need devices for contractors, for example. They don't want to be shipping out physical laptops to everybody. So it could become virtualized hardware that we're talking about. It could be virtual desktop. It could be Windows 365. We could be looking at different needs, but those things still need to have some controls applied. And then when we look at applications themselves, as kind of the fourth pillar, we need to be thinking about what's actually in use as part of, in the organization. And this comes into kind of our migration strategy potentially when we're looking to move from one device management platform to another. But we need to know what applications are being used, because those can be a route in or out for organization data. We need to ensure that access is appropriate for each persona. So we're looking at the principle of least privilege. We're making sure people can access what they need to, but we're not providing blanket access to everything in the organization. We need to look at the deployment method for these applications. If they're SaaS-based solutions, there's very little we need to do on the device management side, besides ensure that that access is there, potentially manage the identity and the logon methods for those. If it's a client server application, then there's likely to be something we need to deploy down to those machines. So the methods get a little bit more tricky. We need to consider the potential for shadow IT. So some people do manage to use applications which are unsanctioned, which are unknown about within IT. How do we pick up and learn from that? How do we kind of recognize those things? And there are tools within the Microsoft suite to do things such as that within Defender for Cloud Apps. And then we've also now got the possibility of things like citizen development. So with the introduction and the growth of the Power Platform, people can create their own applications with low no-code interfaces, which could potentially impact the security posture of the organization or operational processes. So moving on to more of the device management side of things, we're going to look at the challenges of traditional MDM solutions. So when we're talking about traditional MDM solutions, we're talking about things such as SCCM, which are typically hosted on premise. So what that does give you is it gives you a very secure environment where you're in control of everything. But the challenges faced with this is that in order to get their updates, in order to understand kind of the status of those devices, they typically require a line of sight. So we're looking at VPN solutions, we're looking at people physically plugging in devices in order for them to get to what they need to be for all of them to get their updates. So as we said next, the deployment of updates can be impacted by this kind of infrastructure. There's a requirement to maintain that infrastructure. So that's in terms of servers to run the SCCM solutions on. That's in terms of the networks which are used. It's in terms of VPN servers to enable people to get access to it. There's a whole load of infrastructure which needs to be maintained. And then that also places increased pressure on the corporate network. Now, this isn't so much a big factor in most places these days because internet connections and networks are typically built for far more capacity than we actually need. But still having that pressure on the network and having those extra hops for users when they're working from home to get onto a VPN to get those connections, it can just slow the whole process down slightly. And then we've got an inherent overhead for performance and compliance. So that's about making sure all of these servers and pieces of infrastructure are updated. All of these devices are receiving their updates as they should do. There's a lot of cost and maintenance to make sure the servers are running the right OSs and they're getting their updates. So there's a lot of things which is going to have to happen internally from an infrastructure engineer perspective, just to keep all of that that infrastructure compliant, up and running, and at the state that we want it to be to maintain that security posture. When we look at the benefits of cloud management and why we would look to potentially move away from something such as SCCM into something like Intune, we've got a relocation of responsibility. So we're then taking kind of some of that infrastructure requirement and we're saying to Microsoft, we're giving you our license fees, can you take care of this, please? So we're allowing that infrastructure reliance to reduce. We're allowing the levels of investment that we've got to potentially decline in terms of that on-premise infrastructure and in terms of that overhead for maintenance and administration of that. We're also removing the need for the VPN in some aspects. Now, we would never say that this is going to take away from the VPN altogether. There may still be needs for certain things on premise, but as part of that strategy, enabling people to get their Windows updates, their application updates, their compliance policies directly from Microsoft means that they don't have to have that connection in order to maintain a compliant device. We get enhanced monitoring. So we know that the telemetry from those devices is going to land with Microsoft at all times, and we've got endpoint analytics. So we can analyze things like device health far more easily and far more frequently. We can enable remote support. So a lot of people have got remote support tools. But by integrating those into Intune, it means that we can make that pathway a little bit easier to get onto the device and to understand what's going on. So there is an inbuilt integration between TeamViewer and Intune, and Microsoft have also released their remote help solution, and that can be integrated with ITSM tools such as ServiceNow, so that when people log tickets, you can get a direct connection onto those devices. We can ensure that via the cloud, we are applying some security hardening to those resources. So these include things like Defender for Endpoint integration. Defender for Endpoint is included in a lot of the Microsoft 365 licensing now. Therefore, that can start to replace third-party antivirus and anti-malware tools and provide some protection in a consolidated way. It also means that we can place conditional access restrictions on our resources. So we can ensure that people are using compliant or managed devices if we want to before they will get access. We can ensure that they are running the latest updates, the latest patches before we will give them access into our Microsoft environment. We've also got enhanced asset management. So via Azure AD, via Intune, we can get a list of enrolled devices, we can see what state they're in, we can ensure their compliance, and we can monitor those things for shifts in configuration. We've also got the ability to remotely lock, wipe, or remove devices from our environment altogether. So in the event that one of these devices gets lost or stolen, we can take actions to make sure that that access is removed from that device. The corporate data is removed at the next time that logs on to any internet connection, and we can make sure that we're taking control around those things. We're also looking at what is a highly advantageous part of remote working, which is the anytime, anywhere, any device access. So by taking control, by having managed devices, but also BYOD policies, which can be in the form of application management, we're applying appropriate controls to all devices, which makes flexible working a lot easier. And by not having to connect onto a corporate domain in order to access data, it enables that flexibility as we want to. We look at the benefits of cloud management itself, or the migration, I should say. We've looked at the benefits. So there are ways, there are kind of two main ways that we can look at doing this. The first one is a fresh start within kind of Intune. So we can look to create new profiles to reflect how we want devices to look. A lot of SCCM implementations have a lot of legacy configuration. They have things which have changed over a number of years, which may not be relevant anymore. So creating new profiles to reflect what's available in Intune, what's modern management, what restrictions we want to put on devices moving forward, and then kind of re-enrolling devices. It can be a bit of an overhead when we're looking at wiping devices clean in order to start again, but it's also a consideration of over whether we want things to be hybrid domain joined or just Azure AD joined, and how we want these things to manage. But creating a fresh start can allow us to get rid of some of our legacy configuration. In order to make sure that we've got the capabilities within Intune to do everything that potentially we've done before or want to do moving forward, there is a GPO analyzer in there, so we can export those group policy objects as XML. We can run them through the analyzer in Intune, and we can see how many of those function are natively supported and which might need a bit more of a tailored approach via PowerShell or via some other registry settings to be updated, just to make sure that we've got the same level of control. But the progress in the platform means that most things are natively supported now. The other thing that we can do with Fresh Start is we can think about our device refresh program. So if we're in an organization where many are, where they typically have a shelf life for a device, when we know that device is coming up for renewal, we can consider whether that user and persona needs to have the same management structure that they've always had in those devices, or whether we can use that as an opportunity to move them to fresh configuration and to kind of cloud-only management. Where we can't use cloud-only management, we have got the ability to use co-management. So we can connect SCCM and Intune, and we can still use both tool sets together. This can also allow us to kind of sweat the investment on our on-premise infrastructure and allow a slower managed migration to cloud management if we need to. So the way that we can do this is via migration per workload rather than per device. So we can put some workloads into the cloud and move those ahead of schedule. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So if we look at this as a migration to cloud management, but via the co-management workload, just to add a bit of detail onto that bit, what we can do by way of an example is ensure that we've got AD and AAD as kind of a synchronized entity, so that we've got devices and identities in both places. We can enable co-management via SCCM, and then we can enroll our devices in Intune. By enrolling them in Intune, they don't automatically become cloud managed, but it gives us the ability to synchronize those two technologies and to know kind of that we can use either. So then we've got a selection of workloads which we can potentially move to Intune, and we've got 3 states in which we can move these from. So we can keep them on SCCM or config manager. We can put things into pilot Intune, which means the baseline of devices is still from config manager, but we can set up an AD group, and devices that go into that group then receive Intune management for those workloads. And then when we're happy that Intune is capable of taking the load of that workload itself, we can flick that switch over to Intune, and all devices can then receive that configuration from Intune rather than SCCM. So we've got a way of phasing that approach and testing those workloads. So when we look at the workloads that we can use, I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of the key areas here where people have switched to that co-management and the Intune workload are things around the Office click to run apps, the Windows update policies, and endpoint protection, so that we can ensure that we're getting the latest definitions of those things directly from the cloud, regardless of our connection back to the on-premise domain. So when we look at migration to cloud management, there's a couple of things which is important just to understand. Firstly, what is your minimum viable product? Trying to undertake a major transition from kind of on-premise management to cloud management, and trying to reproduce everything that you've got in the current infrastructure on the cloud can be quite an undertaking. So it gives us an opportunity just to take a step back and say, what do these users actually use? What do they actually need? And again, it's a chance for review. So we may have duplicate products in the application estate. We may have more than one thing to read PDFs or create PDFs. Can we pare that back? Can we look for benefits, both from an IT perspective, but also from a financial perspective? Can we look at our file storage and if there's any operational benefits? So if we're moving management of devices to the cloud, can we also move some of our file storage if we haven't already remove that reliance on the on-premise domain, VPNs, etc., and just give people a simpler way of working? And then we can also look at things like local admin access risks. So how are we ensuring that people have got the access to do what they need to do on their device without providing too much access? And coming in some of the future developments within Intune is going to give us the ability to use localized kind of just-in-time admin to allow people to do certain tasks. So if we look at Intune itself as a product set, just over the next couple of slides, firstly, why would we want to use Intune over SCCM? Now, it's already included within existing investments within M365. So from that perspective, we're just kind of consolidating on that, and we're kind of using the tools that we've got access to. It is pretty high in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for unified endpoint management, as shown on the right of this slide. So it's a market leader in its class for managing devices. We've got inherent integration with Defender for Endpoint, but also other parts of the Microsoft security stack. So if we're starting to use things like Sentinel, or we're starting to use things like Defender for cloud apps, we can bring this telemetry with us and have a kind of single pane of glass. There's a huge investment in the platform, which has been happening for the last few years and continues to happen. And then we've also got the ability to use things such as autopilot in conjunction with Intune, which really gives us the ability to refresh devices, deploy new devices, kind of with zero touch, with ease, and to make sure that we're providing the maximum benefit from the platform, which can reduce a huge overhead from IT departments. In terms of extending Intune and what we can do moving forward, you may have seen that Microsoft have released some additional Intune functions. Now these sit on top of the existing licensing, so there is additional investment required for these, and kind of the details of these are still coming out. So the licenses were released in March, The full functionality is still being added to the Intune suite as we go through. But these provide additional security functions. They provide additional abilities to manage those devices, which just further enhances the Intune suite itself. So if we look at Plan 2, what this gives us is a tunnel for mobile application management. So for those BYOD devices that are unenrolled but are accessing corporate data, we get an encrypted VPN tunnel to access that data on top of what's included in terms of protecting data on the device. So we're protecting that in transit with a bit more surety. And then we've also got management for specialty devices in there. So people that are using large screens, Surface Hubs, VR headsets, if they support being managed, then this is bringing them into Intune so that we've got wider capability to manage corporate resources. We've also then got the full Intune suite, which goes above and beyond what we've already got in Intune. So it enables us to use remote help. So where we mentioned earlier, some people may have an investment in TeamViewer. This may be better suited to remote help as an integrated native tool from Microsoft. We've got endpoint privilege management. So this is the just-in-time admin access. So you can allow people to elevate their accounts in order to install certain pieces of software. We've got advanced endpoint analytics, which is going to show us a lot more in terms of device health, log-on times, how people are using those devices, so we can remediate issues within the device estate. And then on the horizon, and this is quite a big one for Intune at the moment, is the third-party app catalog and automated app patching. So we're still waiting for the finer details of what that service looks like, but it's starting to come through now. And it's one of the, not weaknesses in the Intune suite, but it's one of the more time-intensive parts of managing devices is packaging those applications. So we're really interested to see what comes out of that. We've got cloud certificate management. So if we do need certificates for devices, for VPNs, for whatever they need to be, we can manage those certificates natively. And we can also have multiple managed accounts on a single device. So it's removing the necessity for there to be a one-to-one affinity between device and users, making shared devices a lot more accessible for people. So if any of this content today has kind of met with any of your requirements, if you want to know anything further, please feel free to reach out to us either via our SDR team, via our sales teams, or to us directly, and we can arrange for further chats, and we can see what's available to you. For some organisations, there may be funded workshops that we can run. There may be some funding available from Microsoft to work with you in order to progress your move to cloud management. But we're more than happy to have those conversations on a more personal basis and see where we can help you. And then just as a little bit about Cloud Direct and who we are. So we are a Microsoft Partner of the Year finalist last year for solution assessments. So we can get funding from Microsoft to run assessments based on your requirements. We're an Azure Expert MSP, which is one of the highest kind of accolades you can get in Microsoft partnership on the Azure side of the fence. And we also hold a wide array of solutions partners designations as specialists in various areas. So if you do have any requirements across Azure, across modern work, and you need help defining a project, escalating a project, or accelerating your implementation of anything, please do give us a shout. Thank you very much for your time today, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon.